On a remote frozen road in northern Washington, a Navy SEAL on leave gently brought his truck to a stop as snow whipped through the pines. For there, cutting through the vast white silence, was a sight that simply did not belong. A young woman struggled on crutches, a German shepherd, her shadow fiercely guarding each faltering step she took. Snow drenched her jacket. The icy wind sliced through her. Every step forward appeared more grueling than the last. She never waved for rescue, nor did she look behind her. She pushed onward, as if survival was no longer a choice, but a harsh lesson. She had been made to master all alone. The SEAL emerged into the tempest, snow stinging his skin, and he spoke, with a calm that defied the storm. "Get in. Nobody should have to endure a night like this by themselves." Before we start towards us where you are watching this from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss another tale of loyalty, courage, and compassion. Your support means everything to us. The snow fell softly through the northern Washington pines, blanketing the woods and transforming the road into a haunting, endless hallway of quiet. Mason Cole had long ago learned how to navigate the silence. At 35, the U.S. Navy SEAL sat at the wheel of his truck with the bearing of a man who could never completely stand down, even in total stillness. He was broad-shouldered and powerfully framed, wearing his formidable strength quietly. His dark hair cut to regulation was just now being traced by the first whispers of silver at his temples. A neat beard shadowed a face carved with sharp lines and control the type that seldom gave away any emotion. His gaze, unwavering and sharp, had witnessed too much to ever turn away. Just 1 week before those eyes had scanned the scorched earth of Iraq and Syria, Operation Silent Lantern had lasted a full year. Night missions, long watches, civilian rescues kept from the news, and losses that never made the headlines. Mason executed his duties with precision, but that precision exacted a heavy price. Upon returning to base, his commander summoned him not for a ceremony or congratulations. His commander simply observed him for a long moment before speaking bluntly. Mason was holding himself together by sheer discipline. That worked in the field, but it emptied a man's soul if ignored. The directive was delivered softly, yet it was absolute. 6 months of leave, personally sanctioned not for vacation nor for revelry, but to rediscover the simple rhythm of a civilian's breath before the next deployment. The unit couldn't afford a SEAL who operated perfectly while shattering on the inside. Mason took the news without protest. It was his way. Now his truck cut north through the Okanogan-Wenatchee forest, heading back to a cabin and a farm he hadn't called home in years. The land was waiting just as it always had, patient, unbothered, and constant. But everything else was different. 6 years ago, Mason had married Belle Hart, his high school sweetheart. She was so vibrant and stunning back then, with honey blonde hair and a smile that effortlessly pulled you in. Her work was in interior design, a world founded on comfort and beauty, and she thrived on making plans, on gatherings, on tangible proof of a stable life. In the beginning, she swore she understood his calling. She promised him that their love would be enough. It wasn't. On their first anniversary, Mason was deployed and out of reach, deep within a covert operation in the Middle East. The call finally came through a single, fleeting connection to his world. Belle's voice was eerily calm, rehearsed. She confessed she was weary of the solitude, tired of holidays spent mending broken doors alone, exhausted from sleeping next to an empty space. She told him she'd met someone else. Trent Caldwell, a prosperous building contractor who was always there, always reachable, always secure. Mason listened without a word. He didn't plead. He didn't fight back. The mission always came first. Even as his marriage disintegrated over a line full of static and distance, he was protecting families he would never know. He just couldn't save his own. The road ahead tightened as the storm intensified. Snow was coming down harder now, whipped sideways by brutal gusts of wind. Mason eased off the gas, his senses on high alert. That's when he saw it. A shape up ahead, barely a shadow in the swirling white. A young woman struggling along the shoulder of the road. She was leaning hard on a pair of crutches, each movement measured and precarious. One of her legs was gone, replaced by a prosthetic concealed under soaked clothing. At her side, a German shepherd paced, powerful and vigilant, its dense, a black and tan coat already kissed by the falling snow. Mason eased the truck to a deliberate stop. The woman was in her late 20s, slender but coiled with a desperate exhaustion. Dark auburn hair clung damply to her cheeks beneath a knit cap pulled low. Her skin was a stark white from the cold. Her lips tinged blue, yet her eyes burned sharp, wary, intelligent, and untrusting. She kept one hand clutched around the dog's leash as if it tethered her to this world. The dog, around 4 years of age, stood as a steadfast protector at her side. Strong, broad-chested, with knowing amber eyes, he positioned himself subtly. Between Mason and the woman, his muscles tensed but controlled. This was no mere aggressive animal. It was a trained guardian, loyal and deliberate. Mason lowered his window. "There's no traffic to stop," he said evenly. His voice was deep, steady, carrying an authority that commanded respect without ever being raised. "There's no town for miles." Her eyes darted to his jacket, to the faint, rigid outline of a military bearing in his posture. Her grip tightened. A lifetime of pain had taught her caution. The wind howled like a predator between them. Mason held her gaze, not pressing, and said, quietly yet firmly, "Ride with me. No one should have to face a night like this alone." The words were not dramatic or rehearsed. They were a simple, profound truth. She hesitated, her breath clouding in frantic, shallow bursts. Pride waged a war with survival. She had learned trust was a fatal mistake, but the storm didn't care for pride, and her failing leg made endurance a losing battle. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. The dog's tense frame relaxed just enough to signal consent. Mason stepped out, helped her into the passenger seat with a quiet, careful respect, then opened the back door for the German shepherd who climbed in, without resistance settling into his protective post behind her. As Mason pulled back onto the road, the heater began its valiant battle against the cold. Neither spoke. Snow swallowed their tire tracks behind them, but for the first time that night neither of them was moving through the darkness alone. The heater hummed a soft promise as Mason's truck moved deeper into the forest road snow, whispering secrets beneath the tires. For several long minutes, a weighted silence held them. It wasn't awkward. It was cautious, like two wounded souls sharing the same fragile shelter, not yet daring to trust it. Ellie Wren sat stiffly. In the passenger seat, her hands clasped in her lap, fingers ghostly white from the cold and an internal tension. Up close, Mason saw that she couldn't be more than 27, her face holding traces of youth, yet etched with a weariness far beyond her years. She was slender with an almost breakable frame, her narrow shoulders held in a way that seemed to compensate for some deep loss. Her auburn hair, darkened with melted snow, cascaded in loose strands from the edge of a knitted hat. Her skin was so fair it was marked by the faint shadows of sleepless nights. Her eyes were a stormy gray-green, piercing and observant, the eyes of someone who had been forced to learn how to read danger in an instant. Atlas, her German shepherd, was a powerful presence across the back seat, only 4 years old and powerfully built. His coat was thick and clearly loved his ears alert, even as his body began to yield to the cab's warmth. He watched Mason in the rearview mirror, not with aggression, but with a deep, calculating focus, as if he were measuring the man's very soul. This dog was no stray. He was a guardian, a silent protector. After a mile of tense silence, Ellie finally spoke. "It's my birthday," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Her voice was steady, but it carried an emptiness that suggested the words were now meaningless to her. Mason glanced at her for a moment, his eyes returning to the road. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply nodded, acknowledging the profound weight of her statement. Ellie took a slow, deliberate breath. I didn't plan to be out there. I wasn't just wandering. She paused, choosing, her words with immense care, as if the wrong ones might shatter this fragile moment of safety. I was staying with my aunt Apoche, she continued. Her name is Ruth Wren. The name felt cold, carrying no hint of warmth when she spoke it. Ruth was a woman in her early 60s, tall and rigid with iron-gray hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a face molded by decades of stern, unbending conviction. She was part of a small, insular religious community on the outskirts of town, a group that clung to old doctrines and the harshest interpretations of suffering. Ruth believed hardship was a trial sent directly from God. She believed weakness, especially any visible weakness, was a flaw to be purged or cast out. Ellie had lived under Ruth's oppressive roof ever since the accident. They don't say it outright, Ellie began. She said, her gaze lost in the snow. But you know what they think, that if you're broken, you are incomplete, that you remind them of truths they can't face. She made a small movement, adjusting the prosthetic concealed by her coat. The motion was practiced, automatic. Mason saw how she carefully held her. Balance how every single move was deliberate. Their argument began over nothing. It always did. Ellie mentioned applying for remote design work, freelance illustrations, logo design jobs she could do from a chair, quietly without having to ask anyone for help. Ruth heard her out in silence, then said ambition was a form of pride, that accepting her fate with humility meant knowing her place. She told me I refused God's lesson. Ellie whispered, that I was trying to pretend I'm not this way. Atlas shifted, sensing the change in her, breathing. She reached back, her fingers sinking into his fur, grounding herself. I told her that I didn't need to be punished to have faith, Ellie said, and then she told me to get out, just like that. The house hadn't felt like a home for a long time, but when Ruth opened the door, her expression a mask, a coldness settled in Ellie that no storm could replicate. She said I'd return when I understood gratitude. Ellie swallowed. I had nowhere else to turn. The plan was desperate, simple, and foolish. Walk to the old church at the edge of town. It stood abandoned for years, but the stone walls were strong. She figured she could take shelter for the night, try to call for help in the morning. She hadn't counted on the storm moving in so fast. No money, she murmured. No ride. My phone died an hour before you found me. Mason's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched with a fury he held carefully in check. He didn't speak, but Ellie could sense it, that quiet rage of a man who knew how the world can fail the vulnerable. It sounds worse saying it. Out loud? She added softly. It sounds like exactly what it is, Mason countered. Someone shifting their duty onto God. Ellie looked at him surprised. Really? She breathed, his profile. His voice was steady, measured, but a hardened edge lay just beneath the surface forged by a long history of injustice. Wearing different kinds of uniforms, Atlas shifted again, this time settling completely, his heavy head resting against the seat as his breathing evened out. Trust being earned one slow degree at a time. I didn't want help, Ellie said, her voice thin. Out there I couldn't afford to need it. Mason nodded slowly. Needing help doesn't mean you're weak. She let out a short, hollow laugh. That depends entirely on who you're asking. The road began to curve, the trees pressing in around them like silent judges. In the far-off darkness, faint lights pierced the gloom, marking the edge of Mason's property. The storm still raged, but the wind had eased, as if spent from its own ferocious tantrum. Ellie's shoulders sagged just slightly at the sight of the lights. Relief, a flicker in the dark, crossed her face before she could conceal it. I won't be staying long, she said too quickly. Just until the weather breaks. Mason held his silence for a moment. He slowed the truck as they navigated the long, narrow drive that wound its way toward the cabin. "Let's get you warm first," he finally said. "Then we'll figure things out." Ellie nodded, her grip on Atlas's leash finally loosening. Behind them, the forest had swallowed, their tracks, the night closing in on the desperate road she had walked alone. Ahead, the cabin waited a dim beacon, imperfect, but standing strong. And for the first time since dawn, Ellie Wren was no longer just running because she had nowhere else to turn. An immense cold greeted them as Mason pushed the door open, the kind of chill that seeps into the wood after years of being left to solitude. Snow clung to his boots as he stepped across the threshold, flipping on a single lamp that cast a warm, weary glow across the main room. The space was simple, functional. A wooden table etched with the scars of time, a worn couch pressed against the wall, a stone fireplace cold and silent for days. Ellie hesitated in the doorway. Up close, the cabin felt unnervingly intimate, a feeling that clawed at her defenses. She was used to borrowed rooms to spare, beds to the forgotten corners of houses where she never truly belonged. Standing there, she looked suddenly, heartbreakingly small. Mason noticed at once and moved without a word, gently taking her wet coat, hanging it near the fireplace. "Sit," he said softly, not as an order but as a genuine offering. He knelt by the hearth, stacking logs with practiced hands, practiced efficiency. As the fire took hold, a soft crackle grew into a steady hum. Flames began their ascent, filling the space with warmth and the subtle scent of pine. Mason gave Ellie a heavy wool blanket, a towel, and then a mug of steaming water he'd warmed on the stovetop. Atlas was the last to enter, shaking snow from his fur in a wide arc. He was a big German shepherd, 4 years of age, with a muscular chest and keen eyes that saw everything. Once he was dry, he circled Ellie 2 times before settling down, his warm body pressing gently against her leg. He exhaled deeply, finally at ease. Her guard finally down, Ellie clutched the mug, letting the warmth penetrate her chilled fingers. The trembling in her shoulders began to subside, but didn't vanish entirely. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason simply nodded, taking a seat across from her, near enough to feel the fire's glow, yet distant enough to give her space. He waited patiently. After a long silence, Ellie spoke. Again. "Not many people know this," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It wasn't a secret exactly, just that it feels like a heavy burden to place on someone else." She drew a breath that shuddered, betraying her composure. "It was a gas explosion," she finally said, "in the building where we lived. Her parents were just regular people with regular jobs. My dad handled maintenance for the city. My mom was a night nurse over at a pediatric clinic. My little sister Lily, she was only 14, so vibrant and kind, the type of kid who'd bring home hurt birds and weep over animals on the road. We were all asleep when it happened." Ellie recalled waking beneath debris, the air choked with dust and smoke, an unbearable weight crushing the lower half of her body. She remembered screaming until she had no voice left. Help didn't arrive for hours. The doctors were gentle, but they were direct. There was no saving her left leg. "My family? They didn't get out," she said softly. "But I did." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Survivor's guilt isn't some grand dramatic thing. It's quiet. It creeps in during the small moments, like on birthdays or in front of mirrors, or when you ask why one person gets to live while others are gone. Mason listened without a single interruption. He never flinched. He didn't try to rush her pain. When her voice fell silent, he just said, "I'm so sorry you had to carry all of that by yourself." Tears burned at the back of Ellie's eyes. Mason watched the fire, its flickering light dancing in his eyes. "I was married once," he confessed. "A high school sweetheart. We were convinced that loving each other would fix everything." He offered no illusions. He spoke of missed anniversaries, of a crushing silence that stretched across oceans, of how protecting strangers ultimately cost him the one person who promised to stay. "I always thought I could fix it all later," he murmured. "Turns out some wounds don't wait." Outside the storm howled its fury, but inside the fire held. Time stretched on uncounted, unmeasured. Then Mason rose to his feet. He opened the pantry. The contents were sparse. A box of pancake mix, a small bag of sugar, a single stick of butter wrapped in wax paper. From the back of a drawer, he unearthed one candle bent slightly near its wick. Ellie watched him, her expression a mask of confusion. "You told me it was your birthday," he said. "That still counts even if the day fell apart." Worked with a quiet, clumsy determination, the cake came out uneven, its edges darker than they should be. He offered no apologies for it. He just placed it on the table, pressed the candle into the center, and lit it with a steady hand. The flame flickered. Mason cleared his throat, a sudden wave of uncertainty washing over him. He was not a man who sang. Not in front of anyone, not ever. But he did. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ellie. Happy birthday to you." His voice was low, rough around the edges, and beautifully imperfect. It cracked on her name. Ellie pressed a hand to her mouth as the tears finally spilled over. Atlas lifted his great head, his tail thumping once, then twice, sensing the profound shift in the room. He moved closer, placing his chin on Ellie's knee in a silent, grounding gesture of his own. "Make a wish," Mason whispered. "Close your eyes." Ellie obeyed. She didn't wish for the impossible. She wished for warmth, for a feeling of belonging, for nights that didn't end, with her walking away alone in the swallowing dark. She blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, a thin, fragile prayer, then vanished. They sat in the silence that followed. The fire popped softly. Atlas sighed. Two strangers, bound by the ghosts of their past together in the quiet, the vast space between them suddenly no longer empty. For the first time in so long, Ellie didn't feel like survival was a prize she had to earn. Morning crept in quietly. After the storm, with pale light filtering through the frost-etched windows, the world outside the cabin looked washed clean, as though the darkness had stolen some great burden. Ellie would stay a few days. That's what she insisted at first. A practical respite, until the roads opened, until she knew what lay ahead. But the days just bled into one. Another without notice, and the line between temporary and something more profound, something permitted, dissolved. Mason lost himself in the land's rhythm. He split wood behind the cabin, his shoulders in steady, powerful arcs, breath, a white ghost in the freezing air. The work fit him. It was honest, constant, and quiet enough for his thoughts to loosen, their stranglehold. He cleared paths in the snow, walked the fences, and mended the scars the storm had left behind. He seldom spoke while he worked, but the silence held no menace. It was the kind that created space, instead of consuming it. Ellie found her sanctuary indoors at first. She moved so carefully through the cabin, relearning its forgotten shape. She made simple meals from Mason's supplies. Soups that chased the chill from the inside-out bread that settled a comforting weight in the air. She cleaned not because she was ever asked to, but because imposing order on a space made her feel less like a ghost waiting to be sent away. One afternoon, she unrolled a small bundle of sketches from her bag, pinning a few of them to the raw wall near the window. Forest lines a dog's head, a woman in snow, unfinished but standing. The cabin felt less haunted afterward. Atlas became the unspoken bridge. At 4 years old, he was a massive, well-muscled presence, his every movement both precise and easy. In the mornings, he'd nudge Mason's arm insistently, leash held tight in his mouth demanding the morning walk. Mason always yielded, sometimes grumbling, sometimes with a reluctant smile. In the evenings, Atlas would drift to Ellie, lowering his massive head to her lap, eyes half-lidded as if he were guarding her soul. He seemed to understand both humans needed to be anchored, but in very different ways. They ate together almost every night. No candles, no ritual, just their plates on the table, the fire whispering its secrets nearby. Conversation arrived in pieces. A note about the weather. A ghost of a memory about a childhood pet. A question that was left to hang unanswered. Each dawn unfolded in a familiar ritual. Steam ghosted from their mugs, warming their hands as the wind sighed through the pines outside like a deep, slumbering breath. It was Ellie who first felt the shift within herself. The crushing weight on her chest had begun to lift. For the first time in ages, she slept undisturbed by the terrors of the night. A quiet laugh escaped her, once a sound so foreign she instinctively covered her mouth, as if to snatch it back before it could be stolen. Mason saw it all, a silent witness to her slow return, though he never spoke a word of it. He saw the confidence, return to her steps, the way the sudden snap of a twig no longer made her jump. How she could meet his gaze now, without the shadow of expectation in her eyes. Mason's own transformation was more subtle. He started hanging, his jacket on the hook shedding the armor he wore. Even indoors, a silent signal that his watch was over. He lingered at the table, long after the plates were cleared. Then, while mending a broken chair, a low hum surfaced from his chest, an unconscious melody. The sound caught him off guard, startling him more than the storm's fury ever had. On the third morning, with the roads finally clear, the crunch of tires on gravel shattered the quiet. The driver was the local mailman, Tom Avery, a man in his late 50s whose weathered face and a gray beard seemed permanently dusted with frost. He carried out his rounds with a slow, deliberate grace, a rhythm born of routine, not obligation. Tom tipped his cap to Mason, gave a respectful nod toward Ellie, and handed over a small bundle of mail without a single probing question or comment. He never stayed long. He knew not to pry. In a place like this, privacy was the highest form of respect. Ellie watched from the window as Tom's truck disappeared down the lane. She hadn't known she was holding her breath until the engine noise faded. "Not many people come this way," she observed. Mason just shrugged. "Only the ones who need to." That afternoon, Ellie ventured out, more balancing on her crutches to feel the crisp air on her skin. She stood on the porch. Mason worked not far off, a comfortable silence stretching between them like an invisible steadying hand. At one point, she found herself sketching his powerful form against the stark white landscape, his head bent in focus. She kept the drawing to herself. Some moments were meant to be held in secret, safe from the open air. The days passed without declarations or promises. This unspoken boundary felt less like avoidance and more like a profound form of reverence. They had both learned the hard way what happens when hope outpaced the slow work of healing. As dusk settled, the cabin breathed with comforting sounds. The fire crackled, alive, the gentle clatter of plates, atlases, even breaths. Ellie's gaze swept across the room over the drawings on the wall, the chair. Mason had mended the window that no longer screamed of escape. For the first time since that day, since the emptiness, since the endless chain of temporary rooms, Ellie knew she had stopped counting the days. And Mason, staring into the dying embers, felt a silent truth settle in his own heart. He wasn't fixed, he wasn't whole, but the raw ache inside him had eased into something bearable, something real. The scars remained. They just weren't open anymore. The afternoon found a quiet peace, the kind that always follows a brutal storm. Outside, Mason moved along the property line, testing the beams and hinges the storm had battered. His motions were deliberate, focused, as though the work in his hands could cage the thoughts in his head. Inside the cabin, Ellie drifted through the small storeroom at the back of the house. It was a cramped space lined with shelves that held rusted tools, coiled rope jars of screws, and the relics of a life put on hold, not thrown away. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by one small window. She wasn't searching for secrets, and that was what shook her the most. Tucked behind a stack of canvas tarps, her eyes fell on a little wooden box. It bore no markings, save for the faint scratches across its lid, the kind left by years and distracted fingers. The wood was worn smooth where it was held the most, and softened at the corners. Ellie lifted it, feeling its unexpected weight. Inside lay letters, dozens of them penned by hand. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the corners frayed, the ink faded but still readable. Every envelope was marked with the same careful script. Ellie went still. She knew instantly what these were, not from reading a single word yet, but from the sheer care with which they'd been stored. This wasn't something for casual memory. This was preserved and protected. She lowered herself onto an overturned crate, the box heavy in her lap. Her first impulse was to shut the lid and return it to its hiding place. This past didn't belong to her. She'd spent too long in places that weren't hers to forget that rule. Yet a tender, aching human part of her longed to know the man who'd given her shelter without a single question, the man who chopped wood in solemn silence, the man who had sung to her on a night she'd only hoped to endure, not cherish. Ellie's hands shook as she drew a single letter from the pile. Just one. The envelope was addressed in a careful script penned by a younger, more unguarded hand. She unfolded the paper with delicate slowness, as if the years sealed within might fracture. She drew a sharp breath and began to read. To the girl I love. I've been staring at this empty page for what feels like forever, trying to find the words to start, without sounding like an idiot. I'm not great with words. I always worry I'll say the wrong thing or not enough or too much. But I couldn't let one more day pass without you knowing this. Sometimes when I see you in the school hallway, everything else just falls silent. The slamming lockers, the noise, the crowds, none of it matters for a second. It's just you walking by and me trying to remember how to breathe. I don't know how to say it any better than that. No, I'm not some smooth talker. I know I'm clumsy, I get tangled in my own thoughts all the time. But if you ever feel tired, or alone, or if the world just feels heavier than it ought to be, I want to be the guy who shows up for you. Even if I don't have the perfect thing to say, even if all I can do is just stand there and mean it with my whole heart. I don't know where life is going to take me. I have no idea what I'll be doing or where I'll be living. But when I think of who I want by my side while I figure it all out, it's always you. I'm already getting nervous about prom, mainly because I'm terrified I'll step on your feet while we're dancing. I promise I will try my best not to. And if I do, I'll make it up to you with snacks and bad jokes. I guess what I'm stumbling to say is that this is real for me. I don't know much about love yet. Maybe love is something you learn as you go along. If that's true, then I want to learn it with you. Slowly, honestly, one day at a time. Mason. Ellie let the letter fall to her lap, her breath catching in her throat. She felt no jealousy, no resentment at all. What she felt was a deep, aching sorrow, not for herself, but for the pure, simple truth of what had been for a love that was once so untouched. A love untouched by bitterness or separation, a faith that simply being present was everything. And in that one instant, she finally understood. Mason hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost an entire future, a life he had once poured his whole heart and soul into believing. With the utmost care, Ellie folded the letter, returning it to the box, and arranging the others precisely as she had first seen them. She closed the lid, her hand resting on the aged wood for a long, silent moment, paying homage to the life held within it. When she finally rose to her feet, something deep inside her had irrevocably shifted. Later that evening, Mason returned from the biting cold, his boots lightly dusted with fresh snow. Ellie sat at the table, her pencil moving silently across the page. Atlas was nearby, his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded, yet ever watchful. "Did you get everything handled?" Mason asked casually as he hung up his coat. "Yes," Ellie replied softly. Her voice was eerily steady. Too steady. Dinner passed without a single disruption. Their conversation remained light and superficial. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. But Ellie's mind was a world away, consumed by the heartbreaking truth she now carried. That night she lay awake long after the cabin fell into a deep silence, the letter's essence replaying in her mind. Not the specific words, but what they signified. Mason had loved with a pure, unguarded heart. That kind of profound love doesn't simply vanish, it waits. Ellie stared into the darkness of the ceiling. Atlas was curled at the foot of her bed, his steady breathing anchoring her to the turbulent present. By morning, her thoughts had hardened into a firm resolve. If his past ever returned to claim him, she would not be the one who stood in the way. The knock came just before dusk, sharp, insistent, shattering the peaceful quiet Mason had grown accustomed to. Atlas lifted his head first, his ears pricked in alarm, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Mason opened the door and just stood there frozen. Belle was on the porch, snow lightly dusting the shoulders of her long wool coat. She looked thinner than he could recall, her honey blonde hair no longer perfectly styled, but thrown back in haste, loose strands framing a face marked by pure exhaustion. Her skin was ghostly pale, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen mascara smudged faintly beneath them. She had always been beautiful in a way that captured attention so effortlessly. But tonight that beauty felt fragile, strained by fear and overwhelming regret. "Mason," she whispered, as if his name was the only thing keeping her upright. Then she shattered her shoulders, heaving as the words spilled from her broken and desperate. She wept. "I heard you were back." A mutual acquaintance, a former operator from SEAL Team 5, had let it slip. He'd mentioned it so casually, never realizing the tempest it would unleash. She swore she hadn't meant to appear this way. In truth, she had no plan at all. She was just there. Inside, Ellie went rigid, her hand gripping the back of a chair. In that singular moment, she knew exactly who this woman was. An introduction was unnecessary for a truth this raw. Belle's story then began to spill out, a mosaic of shattered pieces. The man she'd chosen over Mason Trent Caldwell had at first seemed like a safe harbor, wealthy present devoted. But that calm was a cruel illusion. His charm had slowly calcified into a suffocating control, his affection twisting into a constant, gnawing suspicion. The social drinking became a desperate habit. Arguments raged into slammed doors. Flimsy apologies were meant to mend the marks left behind. She became an expert at hiding the truth, and then discovered the others. Proof came through whispered rumors and damning text messages she was never meant to find. "I was so wrong," Belle choked out. "I thought love was supposed to be easy. I told myself I deserved more than waiting by myself." Her gaze then shifted past Mason, her eyes finally locking onto Ellie. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, suffocating. "You," Belle hissed, her voice a razor's edge through her tears. "You have no place here. This is my life, my family, my marriage." The words struck Ellie like stones. That night she packed in the quiet darkness. She didn't slam any doors. There were no confrontations. She simply folded her clothes with deliberate care, her hands unwavering even as a profound ache spread through her soul. The pain was a living thing in her chest. Atlas watched her every move, his intelligent eyes clouded with a deep confusion. When she reached down for his leash, he rose instantly, his loyalty absolute. She left a note on the table. It was simple, thanking Mason for everything, for the warmth, for the kindness, and for the few precious days that had taught her what it felt like to breathe again without being afraid. Outside, a fresh blanket of snow had begun to fall. Belle saw it all too late. She turned her head just as Mason was reaching for his coat. "No!" Belle said, a desperate plea in her voice as she grabbed his arm. "Don't you dare chase her. That's the mistake. We can fix what we had." We had a real life." Mason looked down at her hand, clutching his sleeve, then gently, but firmly pried her fingers away. "I did love you once," he said. His voice was quiet. "That doesn't just disappear, but it no longer gets to decide my future." And then he stepped out into the storm, Ellie moved with care. She made her way down the drive crutches, plunging into the fresh powder Atlas walking tight against her leg, as if to shield her from the world, whined her breath shattering in frosted plumes. "Ellie!" His voice pierced the squall. She stopped, but wouldn't turn around. When he caught up to her, his chest laboring for air, snow clinging to his hair and beard, she finally met his gaze. The tears were streaming down her face, her composure shattered. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never should have stayed. I shouldn't have let myself forget my place." Mason shook his head fiercely. "You haven't taken a single thing from me." A broken laugh escaped her. "I'm not whole. I'm difficult. You deserve someone who isn't so damaged." He moved closer, just close enough that Atlas began to wag, his tail with caution, sensing the change in the air. "My life didn't start again in spite of my past," Mason said softly. "It started because of you. Because you sat across from me at my table. You stayed. You brought this house back to life." Ellie's voice cracked with doubt. "What if one morning you wake up and realize I'm not enough for you?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against him, a protective shield, as if he could anchor her to the world. "I am choosing you," he murmured into her hair. "Not from pity and not because you're broken, but because you are here. Because you actually see me. Because a future finally feels possible again with you in it." Atlas pushed against them both, his tail now wagging furiously, whining softly as if pleading for them to remain together. Behind them, a warm light from the cabin glowed steadily through the swirling snow. Inside, Belle was standing all alone, watching their shapes blur behind the frosted glass. A heavy regret settled deep in her chest. She finally understood that some doors, once they are closed, can never be reopened. With one last glance, she turned her back, vanishing into the very night she had brought with her. Mason gently guided Ellie back to the house, taking one cautious step at a time. The snow kept falling, but its bitter cold could no longer touch them. The days after the storm settled into a tranquility that felt earned, not just given. The forest had ceased its roaring outside the cabin walls. Now the snow fell softly, almost gently, as though the land itself had granted them a space to breathe. Then one morning, Mason carried the old wooden box out into the snow. Ellie watched from the porch, wrapped in a heavy sweater, with Atlas resting at her feet. Mason placed the box down near the fire pit, just behind the cabin. He took his time. He opened it with care, taking a final, lingering look at the letters. Within, his expression wasn't angry or resentful, just filled with acknowledgement. "This was all real," he whispered. "They meant something, but they're not part of who I am now." He offered the letters to the flames, one by one. The paper twisted. The ink vanished. His past dissolved into smoke, fading into the frigid night air. Mason stood motionless until the very last ember died out. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. She knew what he was letting go of. It wasn't just a woman, but a shadow of himself that had lingered in memory for far too long. When Mason turned back to her, she pressed her forehead against his chest for a moment. Nothing needed to be said. A week later, Belle returned. This time, her knock wasn't frantic. She simply waited. Belle seemed transformed from that first night. Her shoulders were back, her coat was pristine, her face held a quiet calm. The fragility was still there, but now so was a firm resolve. She spoke softly, her voice void of accusation. "I didn't come here to undo anything," she began. I had to say I'm sorry." She turned to Ellie first, apologizing for the terror, for the harshness born from her own regrets. She confessed she had confused possession with love and suffocating control with a sense of stability. Facing Mason, she thanked him for all the years he had fought for them, and for finally releasing her when she didn't have the strength to leave. Ellie stood by listening. She no longer saw a rival, but a woman struggling under the weight of her own shattered life. When Belle left, there was no sound of a door slamming, only the profound silence of closure. Months drifted by. Spring began to breathe life back into the valley, softening the harsh lines of the snow. Ellie became stronger. She learned the woodland trails moving with growing, assurance on her prosthetic, her laughter echoing more often. Mason was also learning how to build a future that wasn't dictated by orders from the past. Atlas flourished. His coat was a deep black sheen, his world finally secure. 5 months after that first night, Mason drove Ellie back to the exact spot on the forest road where his truck had first stopped. The snow clung to the trees, but it was thinner, now slowly surrendering to the earth. He dropped to one knee. Ellie's breath caught her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mason." He gave a small, nervous smile she'd never witnessed before. He held out a plain, solid ring. "I can't promise you it will be easy," he said, his voice thick. "But I promise, I will choose you every single day I get to." Ellie's voice trembled. "Could you really choose a wife with only one leg?" Mason rose his hands, cradling her face with a tender reverence. "I'm not choosing perfection. I'm choosing the woman who found the strength to walk on when her world had crumbled. And through a beautiful storm of tears and laughter, she whispered yes. Their wedding was intimate, the cabin a handful of cherished friends, the ancient forest their solemn witness. Ellie was radiant in a simple gown. Atlas served as ring-bearer, his tale a blur of pure joy. There was no spectacle, only profound truth. When Mason's leave concluded, a gentle snow returned, blanketing their world in a soft white hush. Ellie watched from beside the truck Atlas, a steady presence at her leg. Mason kissed her deeply, as if memorizing the soul of this very moment. I'll come back for you," he vowed. A knowing smile graced Ellie's lips. "I know." He drove away, a familiar sight, yet this time the road led to where he belonged. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with a thunderclap or a flash of light. They come quietly, often disguised as a stranger who decides to stop. A door that opens unexpectedly, a hand reaching out when the night feels utterly endless. Perhaps that was the divine plan all along. Not changing the storm itself, but placing the right soul on the road at the exact moment another could no longer walk the path alone. In our own lives, we all pray for answers, for signs, for some kind of relief. But so often that answer comes through people, through small acts of incredible courage, through a kindness that asks for nothing in return.